Afternoon to you, Nompu. What's the latest?
Thanks very much, Desiree. Well, you're spot on there about the concerns around, this ginormous problem with Eskom and it needing funds. And there's a concern that it may end up crowding out all the other imperatives, socio-economic imperatives that need to be dealt with by government, like health and education, security, etc., etc. Well, earlier I spoke with Lawson Naidu. He's the Executive Secretary at the Council for the Advancement of the Constitution, and he gave us his thoughts about how important it is for the government to get the balance right in terms of ensuring that the other imperatives are dealt with. I'm joined by Peter Moyo. He's the CEO of Old Mutual. Thanks very much, Mr. Moyo, for joining us. What are your expectations from Tito Mboweni this afternoon?
Morning, Nompu. Well, firstly, I think this is not going to be a very easy budget for the minister. We actually have a lot of competing issues in the country. One, firstly, it's important for us to have a budget that actually engenders confidence in our economy. One that's actually going to talk about growing the economy. So that's really my expectation. But there are a whole lot of things that sit behind that.
The minister can talk about growing the economy, but with Eskom being the elephant in the room currently and needing funding, how is it going to be able to get the balance right, in terms of addressing other important societal issues that will help to stimulate growth in the economy?
Well, I guess that's why we've got a government that must actually understand how to deal with all these competing issues. Eskom is actually quite important in that if we don't sort out the energy position of the country, it becomes difficult for us actually to grow the economy. It becomes difficult for us to see any growth on the industrial side. That aside, there are also other things that we actually have to make sure that the foundation is actually strong. We're actually talking about the high levels of unemployment, but we've got to make sure that our educational system is actually very intact, that when we create some of these people that are going into the economy, they can actually be productive in the economy. We need to do that. So there are a whole lot of things. We actually talk about the health position of our country. What are we going to be doing on all those fronts? And of course, where is the money going to come from? So then you actually have to look at how is actually going to deal with the taxation. Already on the tax side, we are actually at a corporate level. We are actually on the upper end of the average. At a personal side, we're also getting really to the top end. So I don't think it's actually going to be easy for the minister. I wish him good luck, actually.
Absolutely. Now, of course, he's going to make an announcement about assisting Eskom, and of course, there are question marks as to how that will be perceived by the ratings agencies. In the unfortunate event that they don't take kindly to his pronouncements, what sort of impact could a downgrade have on, the finance world? You're the leader of a finance company. What sort of impact would that have in terms of your ability to operate and the kind of fees that you charge your customers?
Well, the starting point is it will make the cost of funding quite expensive. And when you increase the cost of funding, it actually has a negative impact on the consumer spending. And that's why it is really important for us to start thinking about how we really grow this economy. I hope the assistance to Eskom, if the minister talks about that, and I suspect he will, it's actually got to be understood for what it is, because we have to sort out Eskom. And one of the ways that we've got to sort out Eskom is actually government actually maybe stepping in. But when government comes in, we've got to say where is that money going to come from, and therefore how the rating agencies relate to that also becomes important, because that of its own, like I said, makes it a bit expensive when you actually talk about the cost of funding.
Budget aside, just the general government conduct and behaviour, particularly of that of President Cyril Ramaphosa, and all of these state inquiries into the various malfeasance that has been going on, to what extent do you think this is assisting in terms of business confidence and, barring the blip of some of our economic constraints, do you think the picture looks better for the future?
Well, it's actually very, very good that the president is beginning to deal with corruption. Hopefully, when all these commissions are finished, some people are going to be held accountable. So that's actually quite helpful. The president has actually talked about the size of the cabinet. Hopefully, we are actually going to see some consolidation, and therefore the government spend is actually going to be reined on, and that is actually quite helpful. Certainly from a business point of view, it will be something that we're actually going to welcome. But it is actually setting the right kind of tone, which is something that we've needed for some time now as a country.
Sir, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much.
I'm joined by Lawson Naidu, who's the Executive Secretary of the Council for the Advancement of the Constitution. Thanks very much for joining us, Lawson.
Thank you very much.
So, obviously today, the Eskom is really the elephant in the room. And then there's a concern that this may take away from some of our socio-economic imperatives in the country. Just tell us your thoughts.
Well, I think, whilst Eskom is the big issue of the day, and we're waiting to hear what the Minister of Finance has to say about dealing with the debt of Eskom, flagged by the President in the SONA speech. But we can't let that be the only focus of today, because, the budget is an occasion for government to really talk to the people of South Africa about how national revenue is going to be spent by government departments, how it's going to help to alleviate poverty and improve the lives of ordinary people. The President in the State of the Nation address spoke extensively about education, infrastructure, social security, as well as, fighting state capture. So resources need to be deployed to tackle all of those issues, and the Minister therefore is going to have to find some funds in a very difficult economic climate to tackle those challenges.
Are you confident, with the new instalment or the instalment of the new MPA head, that we're going to see a lot more concerted effort to ensure that people's heads roll in terms of the corruption that we're learning about?
Well, I think we welcome the appointment of Advocate Batoya as the new NDPP, but I think, she needs to be given time to be able to do her job. She's inherited a prosecuting authority that is really dysfunctional. They've got a 20% vacancy rate there, low levels of staff morale. They need new staff, they need training, skills development, because they're going to be tackling some very, very complex state capture cases which involve, intrinsic investigations, and so she needs to be given time and resources to be able to do the job properly.
Resources are needed in all sorts of places. One of the areas that the President touched on in SONA was early childhood development, wanting to spread that to all South Africans from their early years. Are you hoping that the Finance Minister will have money for that?
Well, I think he's going to have to make a start, and I think in the things that the President announced, we'll see an incremental approach to implementing these things. It's not an overnight delivery mechanism. It's going to take time to spread that out across the country, but I think we want to see signals in this budget that the President's words in the State of the Nation address were not mere rhetoric, but there is actually a plan to implement that, and that's what we'll be looking for today.
And of course we have our perennial triple scourge of inequality, unemployment and poverty, if I haven't said that already. What are your thoughts around what the budget should be saying to those issues?
Well, I think, tackling the economic crisis, the structural economic crisis that we face is critical, and, Eskom is a critical part of that, because obviously the ratings agencies are looking very closely, Moody's in particular, looking very, very closely at the solution that the Minister comes up with today in terms of dealing with the crisis at Eskom. I don't expect the Minister to say anything about the unbundling of Eskom. That's not his responsibility. That's the responsibility of the Minister of Public Enterprises, Mr. Gordhan. But the Minister needs to find some money to ease the balance sheet at Eskom and allow allow them to keep the lights on, because without that the rest of the economy will flounder.
Okay, so we talk about what government needs to do, and of course today is government's day in terms of what it's going to tell us about the priorities and how it's going to fund them, etc., etc. But when we look at the Eskom situation and what we're hearing about municipal payments and people just flatly refusing to pay, what needs to be done in relation to that? Because everyone really needs to come to the party to solve some of our problems.
Well, I think what the President has laid out in the 2 States of the Nation addresses that he's given so far is really calling on all South Africans to roll up our sleeves and contribute towards the national effort. Government can't do this on its own, and we all need to play our role. And I think this culture of non-payment that exists in parts of our society needs to be tackled, needs to be challenged, and people need to be told that if we want to grow our society, we want to deliver basic services across the country, people have to pay when required to do so. And we cannot have this situation where people consume products and services and don't pay for them.
Thanks very much, Mr. Naidu.
Thank you.
I'm joined by Isabel Fry. She's from the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. Thanks very much for joining us, Isabel.
My pleasure.
So, obviously, the budget speech is eagerly anticipated. Eskom is the big giant, but of course, there are other socio-economic imperatives that need to be dealt with. And from the institute that you're coming from, no doubt you'll be very interested to ensure that we see some support for poverty and inequality and the likes.
Absolutely, and SPI is part of the Budget Justice Coalition, which is a broader civil society organisation or coalition that's looking at socioeconomic justice. My concern is that we seem to lurch from political crisis to political crisis, and that's not undermining the extent of the horror that is the corruption that we're seeing and the need for state-owned enterprises. But our concern is really that 25 years into democracy, what we're seeing are higher levels of inequality and poverty than at 1994. We know that government's done a lot in terms of the social wage, looking at education, housing, healthcare. But in essence, what we're seeing is that people don't have disposable income. They don't have cash in which to buy the necessities. So 1 in 4 people in South Africa goes to bed or lives daily without having enough food to live by, according to WHO, World Health Organization standards. More than 1 in 2 people in South Africa are poor. So the question is, what is to be done about that? People say easily jobs need to be found, but we're essentially looking at about 22 million people of working age who are not in formal and decent work. And each of those generally has a dependency ratio of about sort of 3 to 4 people who are looking at some kind of support from them. At SPI, one of the things that we're calling for is the introduction of a basic income grant, which is something which many countries are looking at, both in the north and in other southern countries. We're saying that as an upper middle income country, it's not that we're poor, it's the distribution. 1% of South Africans has access to 70% of the wealth. Much of that is accumulated apartheid wealth, and we don't think that it's just that continues. In addition to being accumulated, the tax levels on wealth are much lower than that on income. So if you are working, you're basically carrying the bulk of development in South Africa. So for us, looking at social security, looking at increasing the amount of the child support grant to the food poverty line of 587 Rand rather than the 410 Rand, but essentially looking at people between the ages of 18 and 59 who are not employed, not likely to be employed, and have no access to income is a priority that we're looking for.
But of course, government, economists will say, but how can we afford that? You talked about distribution and maybe targeting a wealth tax or the wealthy. But we're also told that if you go down that route, they are able to employ mechanisms whereby they're able to siphon off their wealth and it ends up being counterproductive.
I think that government needs to be careful about rebuilding the trust deficit that exists. For many years, people have been saying there needs to be greater redistribution, and we've been told that there is no money. What we see now is that there was money. It was just the question of how it was used. And in essence, Parliament had the oversight over how it was used. We're asking those people who have the ability to make the decisions to look to the long-term future, to look at the investment in people in South Africa, people who feel that government is not necessarily looking after their best interests. I mean, government is the servant of the people. The Constitution has a lot of lofty words, and so in essence the the money can be found. We're not saying that it has to happen immediately, but in the Constitution there's a term known as progressive realization, which says you do it over time. We just need to have those political statements, those ones that assert the rights of the working poor and the poor to have a decent life. Now, research that we've done shows that a decent standard of living is afforded by people who have a median income of 7,043 rand. We're saying use that as your target and build towards that. The national minimum wage, for instance, which came into effect on the 1st of January this year, is a really good beginning. And that gives a new floor to people who are working in terms of income. But there are many people who don't have that benefit. So in terms of the rights to equality in the Constitution, we're saying that that needs to be addressed as well. And these are not people who are wanting the luxuries of life. These are people looking at the necessities. We're in an economic stagnation, not the official definition, but we're not growing as we want to. And part of that, many economists argue, is because there's no demand. There's no widespread demand from the bottom up. So if you redistribute income, you give people purchasing power, people buy things that are produced locally, not imported goods, and you create a virtuous circle. In essence, we've tried everything else that orthodox economists have been saying, and we haven't seen the results. We believe that it really is time to look into what is the right thing to do.
Thanks very much, Isabel. So there you have it, quite a breadth of different views there from the business sector and civil society. Speaking to Peter Moyos, he's the CEO at Old Mutual, Isabel Fry, she's from the Poverty and Inequalities Study Centre, and Lawson Naidu, Executive Secretary at the Council for the Advancement of the Constitution. We're beginning to get more traffic here in the Parliament precinct, just a couple of hours away before the Finance Minister is due to deliver that much anticipated budget speech. Back to you in studio.